The universe, at its most fundamental level, operates on principles, laws, the cold mathematics of physics, the measured logic of diplomacy, the careful architecture of civilization built across centuries of hard-won understanding. The United Federation of Planets had staked its entire existence on the belief that reason, applied with patience and compassion, could resolve any conflict. That exploration, not conquest, was the highest calling of an intelligent species, that even the darkest corners of the galaxy could be illuminated by dialogue, by empathy, by the simple act of extending a hand rather than raising a weapon. Captain Jean-Luc Picard had tested that belief against the Borg, against the Dominion, against Q, who had once placed all of humanity on trial and found them wanting. He had bent but never broken, argued in the face of annihilation, and staked civilization itself on the proposition that principles matter more than survival instinct. Nothing in 30 years of service had prepared him for what materialized on the bridge of the USS Enterprise at 0347 hours on stardate 51,743.2. The rift opened without warning. Not a wormhole, Lieutenant Commander. Data would later note in his report that the event shared no spectral characteristics with any cataloged spatial phenomenon. Not a transporter signature. Not a cloaking device powering down. The fabric of space simply parted, the way a wound opens in living tissue. And from the tear came something that made the air on the bridge feel suddenly, inexplicably wrong. Every officer present would describe the same sensation in their incident reports. A pressure behind the eyes. A cold certainty that something was watching them, not with sensors, not with cameras, but with something older and more intimate than technology. Ensign Tyla Voss at the con lost her breath entirely for 3 seconds and could not explain why. Lieutenant Daniels at tactical reached instinctively for his phaser before consciously registering any threat. Commander Worf, son of Moke, veteran of 100 battles, felt the hair rise along the back of his neck in a way it had not since facing a gem Hadar's suicide squad on Torga 4, and he had not understood then, and did not understand now, why his body was insisting he run. The figure that stepped through the rift was, by every visual metric, unimpressive. Old. Deeply, profoundly old. In the way that suggested not wisdom accumulated, but something spent. A candle burned down past the wick, still producing light through sheer obstinance. He was robed in black, so complete it seemed to absorb the bridge lighting around it. The fabric layered and heavy, designed for ceremony or concealment or both. His face, what was visible beneath the hood that fell back as he crossed the threshold, was a ruin of pale flesh, deep carved lines. Yellowed skin pulled tight over sharp architecture. Eyes that caught the light and gave nothing back. He stood still for exactly 4 seconds, surveying the bridge of the Enterprise with the unhurried attention of a man, examining something he had not yet decided whether to keep. Then he smiled. Fascinating, he said. His voice was soft. That was the detail every officer remembered afterward. How soft it was. How it should have been lost in the ambient hum of the ship, and yet somehow arrived directly in each listener's ear as though spoken from inches away. Quite unlike anything I've encountered. The architecture alone suggests a civilization of considerable ambition. Picard was already on his feet. 30 years of command had reduced crisis response to reflex. His voice was level before his mind had fully processed what his eyes were seeing. Red alert. Shields up. He descended from the command platform, stopping 10 feet from the intruder, hands clasped behind his back. The posture of a man who would not be moved. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise, representing the United Federation of Planets. You have materialized aboard a Starfleet vessel without authorization. Identify yourself. The old man's smile did not waver. His eyes moved from Picard to Worf, lingering there, then to Data at Ops, then to the view screen showing open stars, then back to Picard. A full inventory. Deliberate, unhurried, utterly unintimidated. My name, he said, is Palpatine. I have held many titles. Emperor, Chancellor, Master. A pause so precise it felt calculated. I find that in new surroundings, it is wisest to begin simply. Worf stepped forward, one hand on his phaser. Captain, his biosigns are reading as humanoid. But there are secondary energy patterns I cannot classify. Whatever he is not unarmed. I assure you, Palpatine said pleasantly. Without looking at Worf, I am exactly what I appear to be. A traveler, an old man, very far from home. His gaze returned to Picard. And you, Captain, you are a man who believes in law. I can see it in how you stand, how you speak. You have already decided what you intend to do with me, and you are hoping I will cooperate. The air on the bridge felt very still. Picard held the old man's gaze. Whatever his body was telling him, that ancient, animal signal that had kept humanoids alive for 100,000 years, screaming at him across some channel that bypassed reason entirely. He held it. Mr. Worf, he said quietly, please escort our guest to a secure medical bay. Full bioscan. No one enters or exits without my authorization. He took one step closer, until there were perhaps 5 feet between him and the man who called himself Emperor. And I would ask, respectfully, that you come. Willingly. The Federation extends hospitality to all travelers. But make no mistake, he let the silence land. You are aboard my ship. Palpatine looked at him for a long moment. Then he inclined his head, the smallest of bows, less deference than acknowledgement, and turned to follow Worf without another word. It was only later, reviewing the bridge recordings, that Picard noticed what the sensors had captured in the moment before compliance. A barely perceptible flicker in the ship's EPS relays. A ghost surge of energy with no identifiable source, lasting 0.3 seconds. As though something had reached out through the ship's systems, touched every circuit, every conduit, and simply taken note. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The medical bay of the Enterprise was not designed to be a cell. Dr. Beverly Crusher had spent years transforming it into something closer to the opposite, a space of healing, of careful attention, of the fundamental Starfleet conviction that every life, regardless of origin, deserved preservation and dignity. The biobeds hummed with quiet purpose. The lighting was calibrated to reduce patient anxiety. Even the restraint protocols, when activated, were designed to be as unobtrusive as possible because Starfleet medical doctrine held that a patient who felt imprisoned healed poorly. Palpatine sat on the central biobed, with his hands folded in his lap, and looked around the room with the patient, cataloging attention of a man who had never once in his life been in a space he did not intend to eventually control. Remarkable, he said softly, watching the diagnostic arch complete its sweep above him. You scan your guests. We scan everyone who comes aboard under unusual circumstances, Crusher said. She kept her voice neutral, professional, her eyes on the readouts rather than the man. The readouts were not making her feel better. It's standard medical protocol. I'll need you to remain still. Of course. He did not move. He had not moved since sitting down. Not a fidget, not a shift of weight. Not the unconscious micro-adjustments that living bodies make without thinking. He was preternaturally still in a way that reminded Crusher, unpleasantly, of something that had decided stillness was the most efficient form of patience. You are troubled by what you see. She looked up then, because it was easier to address him directly than to pretend she hadn't heard. Your humanoid biology is consistent with a human or near-human baseline. Age-advanced, but stable. What isn't consistent is the secondary energy field your body is generating. She turned the display toward him, more out of professional habit than any expectation he would understand it. It doesn't match any known biological or technological signature in our database. It's not radiation. It's not a personal shield. It reads almost like. She hesitated. Like what, doctor? Like a field generated by neural activity, she said carefully. Except the output is approximately 400 times what any known humanoid brain is capable of producing. Palpatine smiled at the display with what looked, for just a moment, like genuine pleasure. How gratifying, he said, that your instruments are sensitive enough to detect it at all. The door slid open and Picard entered, followed by Data and Counselor Deanna Troi. Troi had been on the bridge when Palpatine arrived. She had requested, quietly and with unusual urgency, to be included in this initial assessment. Picard had not asked her to explain. Her expression now, as she entered the medical bay and the distance between her and the patient closed, was controlled with visible effort. Counselor, Palpatine said, without turning. You sense emotions. A remarkable gift. I imagine this posting offers considerable variety. Troy stopped walking, just for a half step, an involuntary pause that she covered immediately, moving to stand beside Picard. But Palpatine had been watching the door's reflection in the diagnostic screen, and he had seen it, and the corner of his mouth registered the fact with microscopic satisfaction. How are you aware of Counselor Troy's abilities? Picard asked. I am aware of a great many things, Captain. Awareness is, one might say, my primary vocation. He turned to face them fully, hands still folded, posture still that eerie, composed stillness. I am also aware that you have placed security personnel outside this room, that your tactical officer is monitoring my biosigns from the bridge, and that you are debating, even now, whether Federation law applies to an individual from outside Federation space. He tilted his head. A genuine philosophical question. I don't raise it to be provocative. I raise it because I suspect you are a man who prefers his dilemmas named plainly. Picard studied him. Where do you come from? A galaxy much like this one. Perhaps not so different in its fundamental hungers. A pause. I was emperor. I governed over 1 trillion lives across thousands of worlds. I held that authority for decades through the application of law, order, and the understanding that civilization requires a firm hand to survive the chaos that always waits at its edges. His yellow eyes found Picard's and held them. I suspect you disagree with my methods. I don't know your methods yet, Picard said. I know what you've called yourself. Titles tell me very little. On the contrary, Captain, titles tell you everything. They tell you what a civilization values, what it fears, what it has decided to worship. He glanced at Data. Your officer, he is not biological? I am an android, Data said. Lieutenant Commander Data, Operations Officer. I am curious. The energy field Dr. Crusher has identified. In your civilization, is it a known phenomenon? It is called the Force, Palpatine said simply. It is the connective energy of all living things. In my galaxy, certain individuals can perceive it, draw upon it, shape it. I am among the more accomplished practitioners. Telekinesis, Data said. Telepathic suggestion, enhanced reflexes, and physical capability. Is this consistent with your abilities? A serviceable summary. He looked at Data, with an expression that was not quite condescension, but was related to it, the look of a man, translating a complex text into simpler language for a younger reader. Though I find telekinesis rather undersells the poetry of it. Picard had been listening with his hands behind his back, processing. Now he moved, one deliberate step forward, claiming the space, establishing the geometry of the room. I'm going to be direct with you. I don't know what you are, where you came from, or how you arrived on my ship. What I do know is that you are here, aboard a Federation vessel, and that makes you subject to Federation law and Starfleet regulation until such time as your situation is more fully understood. He met the yellow eyes without flinching. I am placing you under protective custody. You will be confined to these quarters, comfortable quarters, with full access to recreational and nutritional facilities, while my crew investigates the phenomenon that brought you here. You will not have access to ship systems, crew members without supervision or communications. Palpatine was quiet for 3 seconds. Protective custody, he repeated. The words moved through his mouth as though he were tasting something novel and mildly interesting. How very Federation of you, Captain. You arrest a man and call it protection. I prefer to think of it, Picard said, as an abundance of caution. Troy touched Picard's arm as they left, a brief, tight grip that communicated something she did not want to say in the room. He glanced at her. Her dark eyes were controlled, but underneath the control was something he recognized from years of reading her. Expressions in crisis. Not fear, exactly. Fear had a quality of surprise to it. This was older. This was dread. He's not worried, she murmured in the corridor, quiet enough that only Picard heard. Not at all. She paused, searching for precision. He's interested, Captain. In all of us. In everything. He's making a study. Picard looked at the closed medical bay doors. Then we had better learn faster than he does, he said. The conference room on Deck 2 had hosted negotiations with Klingon chancellors, Romulan ambassadors, and on one memorable occasion, a being of pure energy who had needed 3 hours and a philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness before agreeing to release the crew of a colony ship. Picard had always found the room's long viewport, stars drifting in slow, indifferent procession, to be a useful reminder that whatever crisis occupied the table, the universe continued regardless. Perspective was, in his experience, the most underrated tactical resource available to a Starfleet captain. He sat at the head of the table now and found that perspective was offering him very little comfort. "Begin," he said. Data folded his hands on the table with the precise symmetry he brought to everything. "I have completed a preliminary analysis of the dimensional rift and of the energy signature associated with our guest. The rift itself shares certain theoretical characteristics with what Federation physicists have categorized as a quantum fissure, a point where the membrane between parallel or adjacent universes becomes temporarily permeable. However, the energy catalyst appears to have originated from within the anomaly rather than from external forces. In other words, the rift did not simply happen around Palpatine. There is a non-trivial possibility that it happened, at least in part, because of him." The table was quiet. "You're suggesting he opened it," Riker said. "I am suggesting the data does not rule it out. The force energy readings Dr. Crusher recorded show a specific resonance pattern that appears in the rift's spectral analysis as well, like a key and its corresponding lock. Whether intentional or not, his presence or his power may have been the mechanism of transit." "Can he do it again?" Worf asked. The question had the flat, operational quality of a man already calculating contingencies. "Unknown. The rift has since collapsed. Reconstructing it would require either another energy event of equivalent magnitude or a technological solution we do not currently possess." Data paused. "However, I would note that if he opened it once, the capacity may remain." Picard absorbed this. "Deanna, your assessment." Troy had been quiet since entering the room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't drunk. She looked up with the careful expression of someone choosing words the way a person chooses footing on uncertain ground. "Empathically, he is unlike anything I've encountered. Most beings, regardless of species, have an emotional signature I can read with reasonable clarity: fear, desire, deception, sincerity. The architecture is different across cultures, but the fundamentals are consistent." She set the cup down. "With Palpatine, I can sense the surface, what he allows me to sense. Beneath that there is something very large and very old and completely deliberate, and I cannot see past it. He knows I'm reading him. He is managing what I receive. He's controlling his own emotional output," Riker said slowly. "Like a directed broadcast. More like a carefully curated gallery," Troy said. "He shows you exactly what he wants you to see and nothing else. The control required for that is—" She paused. "Extraordinary. I've encountered trained Vulcan meditators who couldn't manage it at that level." "Which means," Picard said, "that everything he has shown us so far, the cooperation, the curiosity, the intellectual engagement, may be performance. Not necessarily false," Troy said carefully, "but selected. He is genuinely curious. I'm confident of that much. But curiosity in service of what, I cannot determine." Geordi LaForge leaned forward from the far end of the table. "I've been going over the EPS flicker we caught on the bridge recording. That 0.3-second energy surge right before he agreed to be escorted. I ran it through 3 different diagnostic filters, and I keep getting the same result. He touched our systems. Not physically, not through any interface we have a record of. He reached out with whatever he's generating, and he made contact with the Enterprise's power grid." He shook his head. "It lasted less than a third of a second. But in that time he got a read on our primary and secondary power distribution, our shield emitter configuration. And this is the part that bothers me, our internal sensor grid. The table absorbed this. He mapped the ship," Riker said. "In 0.3 seconds, Geordi confirmed. From the bridge. Without touching anything." Worf stood. "Captain, I must advise confining him to a level 10 force field containment cell immediately. What we are describing is an individual who has already conducted a reconnaissance of this vessel's defensive infrastructure. Protective custody is insufficient." Mr. Worf. Picard's voice was measured. We do not imprison people because of what they might do. We are not Cardassians. With respect, Captain, we are also not naive. Worf's jaw was set in the particular configuration. That meant he had something to say that he suspected Picard would not enjoy. In Klingon culture, there is a concept, VSA, which translates approximately as the enemy who smiles. The tradition holds that a warrior who attacks with a blade is honorable and comprehensible. The warrior who smiles while studying your defenses is something else. I am not proposing we abandon Federation principles. I am proposing we do not allow those principles to become the weapon used against us. Picard was quiet for a moment. The stars moved in the viewport. Increase internal sensor resolution in his quarters to maximum. I want a continuous feed. Double the security rotation. No. Officer is to interact with him alone under any circumstances. He looked around the table. We will speak with him formally. Together. I want data present for scientific analysis and Deanna present for empathic monitoring. We treat him with the dignity Federation law requires. And we do not, he said, with quiet emphasis, underestimate him. He did not say, because he is already several steps ahead of us. He did not need to. What none of them knew, what the internal sensors, for all their increased resolution, failed to capture, was that in his quarters on Deck 8, Palpatine sat in the dark with his eyes closed and his hands resting on his knees. And he was not resting. He was listening to the ship, to the hum of its systems, the rhythm of its power distribution, the tiny variations in its warp field that told him more about its structural tolerances than any schematic. He was listening to the 143 heartbeats he could now distinguish, individually within sensor range, mapping them to locations, to stress patterns, to the particular emotional frequencies that the counselor's abilities had reminded him to account for. He was, as he had been for 60 years, learning the terrain. And he found it. All of it. The ship, the crew, the captain with his principles held like a shield. Quite promising. The subspace communication arrived at 0612 hours, before the beta shift had fully turned over to Alpha. In the quiet interval, when the Enterprise ran on skeleton, crew and the corridors held that particular early morning stillness that felt, on a starship, like the pause between heartbeats. Lieutenant Hawk flagged it immediately. Origin point, deep Romulan space. Encrypted on a frequency the Tal Shear used when they did not want the message to appear in standard intercept logs. The encryption was good. Starfleet intelligence had broken the cipher variant 18 months ago and hadn't mentioned it to the Romulans. Picard read the decoded text twice before calling Riker. The message was brief. It identified the sender as Subcommander Veleth of the Tal Shear's External Operations Division, a name that appeared in 3 separate Federation intelligence files with the annotation extremely dangerous, approach with extreme caution. It expressed, with the particular flavor of Romulan diplomatic language that managed to be simultaneously courteous and threatening, an awareness that the Enterprise had recently acquired an unusual passenger. It extended an invitation for that passenger to accept Romulan sanctuary, framed as concern for the well-being of a dimensional traveler far from home. And it noted, with the careful precision of someone who wanted their meaning understood without being recorded, saying it plainly, that the Romulan Star Empire had resources for understanding, unique individuals that the Federation, bound as it was by its many regulations, did not. It was, Picard thought, an exceptionally well-constructed document. It offered Palpatine something real, freedom, resources, the absence of Federation oversight, while giving the Romulans plausible deniability. If the message were ever presented in an official context, whoever Veleth was, they had done this before. The question that occupied Picard through his morning tea was not whether the Romulans had made contact. It was how they had known so quickly. Someone on this ship transmitted our sensor logs, Riker said flatly, standing across the desk in Picard's ready room. Within 2 hours of Palpatine's arrival. That is the most likely explanation, which means we have a leak. And our guest has been aboard for approximately 9 hours. Picard set down his cup. He hasn't had access to communications. He doesn't need access, Riker said. He has whatever he used on the EPS relays. and we have 143 crew members, some of whom, no matter how carefully selected, have families, debts, ideological commitments, or simply bad judgment. He paused, or he touched someone's mind the way he touched the power grid. The thought sat between them with considerable unpleasantness. I want security reviewing all outgoing transmissions from the past 12 hours, Picard said. Priority 1. And I want Palpatine informed of the Romulan message. Riker looked up. You want to tell him? He almost certainly already knows it was sent. Picard stood, moving to the viewport. The stars beyond were neutral, unhelpful. Keeping it from him accomplishes nothing except confirming that we manage information the way the Romulans do. I will not begin a relationship, even a relationship of custody, with deception. We tell him, we watch how he responds, and we learn something. He turned. Have him brought to holodeck. 2. I want a neutral environment. Not the medical bay, not an interrogation room. Somewhere that doesn't announce its purpose. You're going to have a conversation with him. I'm going to have a conversation with him, Picard confirmed. And I am going to be very, very careful about what I say. The holodeck rendered a garden. Picard had chosen it deliberately, not the formality of the observation lounge, not the clinical neutrality of the conference room, but something older and more human. Stone paths between low hedgerows, morning light through a high glass ceiling, the sound of water moving somewhere out of sight. It was based on a garden at the Académie de la Sorbonne that Picard had visited as a young man, the kind of place that made philosophical discussion feel natural rather than adversarial. Palpatine entered with his security escort and stopped just inside the arch, taking in the environment with a single slow sweep of his gaze that managed to convey both appreciation and the awareness that he was being managed. Clever, he said. You want me comfortable. I want us both comfortable, Picard said, gesturing to a pair of stone benches facing each other across a low table. Please. They sat, the security officers positioned themselves at a respectful distance, close enough to respond, far enough to suggest the fiction of privacy. Palpatine arranged his robes with unhurried precision and folded his hands, and waited with that absolute, unnerving stillness. You've received a communication, Picard said, from the Romulan Tal Shiar. I wanted you to know that we are aware of it, and that we intercepted and decoded it before it reached you. A pause. Palpatine's expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something behind his eyes shifted, a faint recalibration. The way a strategist adjusts when an opponent makes an unexpected move. You decoded a Tal Shiar encryption. Some time ago? We haven't mentioned it to them. No. The ghost of a smile. I imagine not. He tilted his head. And you tell me this because I prefer honesty to the alternative, Picard said. And because I suspect you already knew the message had been sent, which means concealing our knowledge of it would simply confirm that we operate through misdirection. I'd rather establish a different precedent. Palpatine studied him with an attention that was almost tactile, the sensation Picard had noticed in their brief previous encounters, of being read at a depth that went past observation, into something more intimate and less comfortable. You are attempting to demonstrate trustworthiness, Palpatine said, to distinguish the Federation from other powers I might encounter here. It is a sophisticated opening. He paused. It is also entirely sincere, which makes it more sophisticated still. I'm not playing a game, Picard said. Everyone is playing a game, Captain. The only variable is whether they know it. Palpatine looked out at the holographic garden with an expression that was, for the first time, difficult to read, not because it was concealed, but because it was complicated. The Romulans offer sanctuary, resources, freedom from your regulations. He returned his gaze to Picard. What does the Federation offer? Picard met his eyes. The truth about how you got here, and perhaps a way home. The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere in the program, water moved over stone. Palpatine was silent for 7 seconds, long enough that it felt intentional, long enough that Picard understood he was being shown something deliberate. Then the old man nodded, once, with the gravity of a man making a notation in a very long mental ledger. Then we have something to discuss, he said, and smiled. It was the smile, Picard would reflect later, that he should have been more afraid of. The formal hearing convened at 1,400 hours in Holodeck 3, configured to approximate a Federation judicial chamber, not a full court. Picard had been careful to specify, but a proceeding of record. There was a meaningful difference, legally and philosophically, between an interrogation and a hearing, and Picard intended to honor it. A long table faced a single chair. Data sat to Picard's left with a PADD and the precise, unself-conscious attention he brought to everything. Troy sat to Picard's right, her hands folded, her expression composed over whatever the room was doing to her empathic senses. Riker anchored the far end. Worf stood at the door in a posture that communicated, without ambiguity, that he was not there as a formality. Palpatine entered and sat in the single chair as though he had chosen it himself. Picard opened the record. This proceeding is being logged under Starfleet Regulation 114, governing the assessment and temporary detention of individuals whose origin, identity, or capabilities present an unresolved risk to crew or vessel. You are not on trial. You have not been charged with any offense under Federation law. You are, however, subject to questioning, and your responses will be entered into the official record of this vessel. He paused. Do you understand? I understand perfectly, Palpatine said. You have constructed a proceeding that is legally defensible, philosophically consistent with your principles, and designed to extract maximum information while offering me the dignity of formal process. He inclined his head. I find it admirable. Please continue. Troy made a small note on her PADD. Genuine appreciation, not sarcasm. In your galaxy, Picard began, you described yourself as emperor, governing over 1 trillion lives. Can you tell us the nature of that governance? How it was established and how it was maintained? The question was deliberate, not a technical inquiry, but a values inquiry. Picard wanted to understand not what Palpatine had done, but what he believed justified it. Palpatine was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, Picard had the distinct impression that the man was deciding, not what to say, but how much truth to deploy. The galaxy I governed, he said finally, was ancient. Thousands of years of republic, of democratic process, of Senate chambers and committees, and the slow, grinding machinery of consensus. It had produced, over those millennia, extraordinary art, remarkable science, genuine moments of civilization. He paused. It had also produced corruption so pervasive and so normalized that the institutions designed to address it had become its primary vehicles. The Senate did not govern. It negotiated the terms of its own paralysis. His voice remained soft, conversational, the tone of a man reflecting rather than arguing. I did not destroy a functioning democracy, Captain. I dissolved a corpse that had forgotten it was dead, and replaced it with an empire under your sole authority, Picard said. I replaced chaos with order, inefficiency with decisiveness, the endless deferral of necessary action with the capacity to act. He met Picard's gaze with yellow eyes that held something, old and entirely convinced. I am aware that your Federation finds this objectionable. You have built your civilization on the opposite premise, that distributed authority, however slow, however messy, produces better outcomes than concentrated power. It is a genuine philosophical position, and I respect it. A beat. I simply believe you have not yet encountered the crisis that will test it to destruction. The Federation has survived considerable crises, Riker said. You have survived the crises you have so far encountered. Palpatine said pleasantly. That is a different statement. He turned back to Picard. I don't raise this to be provocative. I raise it because you asked me an honest question and I am giving you an honest answer. I believe in order. I believe that civilization is fragile, and that its fragility requires strength to protect it. I have applied that belief at a scale you have not been required to. He folded his hands. Whether that makes me a tyrant or a necessary architect depends entirely on what you value most, the method or the outcome. Data spoke without looking up from his PADD. The outcome of your governance included, by historical standard, significant suppression of individual rights, systematic elimination of political opposition, and the maintenance of authority through institutional fear. He looked up. These are not value judgments. They are categorical observations based on your description. Palpatine looked at Data with what appeared to be genuine interest. You are correct. They are also accurate descriptions of every stable civilization in recorded history at sufficient scale. The variable is not whether those Mechanisms exist, it is. Whether they are acknowledged or disguised. He tilted his head. Your Federation, for example, has a division called Section 31. The table went very still. An organization that operates outside your stated principles. Palpatine continued, his voice unchanged. Conversational still, conducting operations your official institutions cannot authorize. Eliminating threats before they materialize. Maintaining the order that allows your idealism to function. He looked at each of them in turn. I did not learn this from your databases, which I have not accessed. I learned it from the emotional responses in this room when I said the words. The slight tension. The careful non-reaction that is itself a reaction. His gaze settled on Picard. You know about Section 31, Captain, and it troubles you deeply, because it is the thing that lives inside your civilization that proves my point. Picard's voice was level. Section 31 does not represent Federation values. No, Palpatine agreed. It represents Federation necessity. There is a difference, and the fact that your civilization requires it while officially disavowing it suggests that the distance between your principles and my methods is, he paused, a matter of scale rather than kind. The hearing continued for another 40 minutes. Palpatine answered every question fully, thoughtfully, without evasion, and every answer was a precisely targeted strike against something the crew believed about themselves and their civilization. Not crude attacks, observations, careful, accurate, arriving like water finding cracks in stone. It was only afterward, reviewing the recording alone in his ready room, that Picard identified what had bothered him most about the proceeding. Not what Palpatine had said, not even that some of it was difficult to refute. It was that throughout the entire hearing, across 2 hours of careful questioning by 4 experienced Starfleet officers, Counselor Troy had not once caught him in a lie. Every word had been the truth. And somehow, that was the most frightening thing of all. Worf found him in the gymnasium on Deck 12 at 2,100 hours. It had not been planned. Worf's evening combat training was scheduled, as it had been for 11 years, with the regularity of a man who believed that physical discipline was not recreation but obligation, a debt paid daily to the warrior tradition that had shaped him. He had not considered that security protocols required someone to accompany Palpatine wherever he went, and that Palpatine had requested, with elaborate courtesy, the use of a physical training space. He had not considered that the duty roster would assign the overnight security detail to officers who were, through no fault of their own, significantly less senior than the situation warranted. He had not considered any of this until he stepped through the gymnasium door and found the Emperor of a distant galaxy standing in the center of the room in his black robes, examining the weight training equipment with the detached curiosity of an archaeologist, cataloging artifacts. Worf stopped in the doorway. The 2 ensigns assigned as escort stood against the far wall with the particular stillness of junior officers, who were very aware that something was happening that exceeded their rank to manage. Palpatine turned. Ah, he said. The Klingon. Lieutenant Commander Worf, Worf said. Chief of Security. Yes. Palpatine's gaze moved over him with that cataloging attention. Slower than it had been with the others, more thorough. You are different from your crewmates. You feel things more directly. Your responses are less mediated by institutional training. A pause. It is refreshing. I did not come here to be analyzed, Worf said. He crossed the room to the ensigns, spoke to them quietly, and relieved them, sending them to positions outside the door. It was, he would acknowledge to himself later, not strictly by the book, but he had learned, over a career that included the Dominion War and 3 separate postings under Picard, that some situations required the senior officer to be in the room. He turned back to Palpatine. You requested a training space. In his ready room. That Picard identified what had bothered him most about the proceeding. Not what Palpatine had said, not even that some of it was difficult to refute. It was that throughout the entire hearing, across 2 hours of careful questioning by 4 experienced Starfleet officers, Counselor Troy had not once caught him in a lie. Every word had been the truth. And somehow, that was the most frightening thing of all. Worf found him in the gymnasium on Deck 12 at 2,100 hours. It had not been planned. Worf's evening combat training was scheduled, as it had been for 11 years, with the regularity of a man who believed that physical discipline was not recreation but obligation, a debt paid daily to the warrior tradition that had shaped him. He had not considered that security protocols required someone to accompany Palpatine wherever he went, and that Palpatine had requested, with elaborate courtesy, the use of a physical training space. He had not considered that the duty roster would assign the overnight security detail to officers who were, through no fault of their own, significantly less senior than the situation warranted. He had not considered any of this until he stepped through the gymnasium door and found the Emperor of a distant galaxy standing in the center of the room in his black robes, examining the weight training equipment with the detached curiosity of an archaeologist cataloging artifacts. Worf stopped in the doorway. The two ensigns assigned as escort stood against the far wall with the particular stillness of junior officers who were very aware that something was happening that exceeded their rank to manage. Palpatine turned. "Ah," he said. "The Klingon. Lieutenant Commander Worf," Worf said. "Chief of Security." "Yes." Palpatine's gaze moved over him with that cataloging attention, slower than it had been with the others, more thorough. "You are different from your crewmates. You feel things more directly. Your responses are less mediated by institutional training." A pause. "It is refreshing. I did not come here to be analyzed," Worf said. He crossed the room to the ensigns, spoke to them quietly, and relieved them, sending them to positions outside the door. It was, he would acknowledge to himself later, not strictly by the book, but he had learned, over a career that included the Dominion War and 3 separate postings under Picard, that some situations required the senior officer to be in the room. He turned back to Palpatine. "You requested a training space. I find that physical practice clarifies thought, a discipline I suspect you share." Palpatine moved toward the center of the room with that unsettling economy of motion, no wasted movement, no concession to age in the way his body tracked through space. "In my experience, warriors understand certain things that diplomats do not. About power, about what it costs and what it requires. In my experience," Worf said, "those who speak most about power rarely understand honor." Palpatine stopped. Something moved in his expression, not offense, but a sharpening, the way a blade responds to a whetstone. "Honor," he said. "Tell me what you mean." "Honor is not winning," Worf said. "Any fool can win with sufficient force. Honor is the choice made when winning requires a cost. When you can take the easy path and you choose the harder one because it is right." He held Palpatine's gaze with the directness that was, for a Klingon, the most basic form of respect, the acknowledgement that the other person was worth looking at directly. "From what I have heard today, you chose easy paths and called them necessary ones." The gymnasium was quiet. The ambient hum of the ship moved through the floor beneath them. "You are," Palpatine said slowly, "more interesting than I expected." He tilted his head. "And you are angry. Not the performed anger your captain uses to signal seriousness. Genuine anger. You believe I am dangerous and you believe your captain is being too cautious, and it is costing you something to stand here and follow protocols rather than act on your instinct." Worf said nothing, which was, itself, an answer. "What would you do," Palpatine asked, "if there were no protocols, no Federation law, no captain's orders, no institutional obligation? If it were simply you and your judgment and whatever consequence followed?" "I would," Worf said carefully, "ensure that you could not harm this crew. With lethal force, if necessary." Palpatine nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had suspected. "And yet you are here, following protocols, containing your instinct within the boundaries your civilization has drawn." He moved, not toward Worf, but laterally, a slow circuit of the room's center, hands behind his back. "That is the paradox of the warrior in a civilized institution, isn't it? You are kept precisely because you are capable of violence. And you are constrained precisely because you are capable of violence. You are simultaneously the most valuable and the most controlled person on this ship. All members of this crew operate within appropriate boundaries," Worf said. "Your captain operates within boundaries he has chosen because he believes in them," Palpatine said. "You operate within boundaries imposed on instincts that would, left alone, exceed them. There is a meaningful difference." He stopped his circuit, facing Worf across 10 feet of open floor. I am not criticizing you. I am saying that I recognize you. In my experience, the warriors who chafe most against institutional constraint are the ones the institution cannot afford to lose and cannot afford to fully trust. Worf's jaw tightened. You are attempting to create distance between myself and my captain. I am having a conversation, Palpatine said mildly. You are doing both simultaneously. Worf took 2 steps forward, not aggressive, but deliberate, closing the distance to 5 feet, establishing that he would not be managed from across a room. I have served under Jean-Luc Picard for many years. I have disagreed with him. I have challenged his decisions through proper channels. I have, on occasion, believed he was wrong. He held the yellow eyes without difficulty. A Klingon did not look away from a predator, ever. And I have never once doubted that he is a man of complete integrity operating from genuine principle. Whatever you are doing on this ship, you will not find a fracture there. Palpatine looked at him for a long moment. Then, with a slowness that was deliberate and somehow more unsettling than speed would have been, he raised one hand. The lights in the gymnasium flickered. Every piece of equipment in the room shifted, not dramatically, not violently, but simultaneously, a half-inch displacement in every direction, as though the room had taken a breath. The air pressure changed. Something at the edge of hearing produced a sound that was less a sound than a vibration felt in the back of the skull. And Worf felt it, not physically, but somewhere below physical. In whatever part of a Klingon, warrior registers the presence of something genuinely outside their experience. A pressure, an awareness, the sense of standing at the edge of something that had no bottom. Palpatine lowered his hand. The room returned to normal. The entire event had lasted perhaps 2 seconds. I am aware, Palpatine said quietly, of what I am capable of. I want you to be aware as well. Not as a threat. He met Worf's eyes with something that was startlingly close to respect. As honesty. You asked for directness. I am providing it. He turned toward the door. Tell your captain that I found our conversation instructive. And tell him, he paused at the threshold, that his choice of security officer is, perhaps, the best decision he has made since I arrived. He left. Worf stood in the empty gymnasium for 30 seconds, breathing with the controlled deliberateness of a man re-establishing equilibrium. Then he tapped his comm badge. Worf to Picard. Go ahead, Mr. Worf. Captain. A pause, brief, but long enough for Picard, who knew him well, to register it. We need to talk. Section 31 did not knock. That was, Picard had always felt, the most honest thing about them, the way their representatives simply appeared, in spaces they should not have been able to access, at hours carefully chosen to communicate that normal protocols did not apply to them. The man who materialized in Picard's ready room at 0200 hours the following morning used a transporter frequency that bypassed the Enterprise's shields through a variance in the emitter harmonics. That Geordi would spend 3 days afterward trying to close. He was unremarkable in appearance, middle height, middle age, a civilian jacket over a nondescript tunic. The kind of face that memory released almost immediately after seeing it. He sat in the chair across from Picard's desk without being invited in, placed a small data chip on the surface between them. Captain Picard, he said, my name isn't important. Picard looked at the data chip, then at the man, then at the door, which had not triggered any security alert, which meant either the man had disabled that too or the alert had been intercepted before it reached Worf's console. Neither possibility was comforting. How you got onto my ship is going to be the first thing we discuss, Picard said. We can discuss whatever you'd like, the man said pleasantly. But I'd suggest starting with what's on that ship, because it's relevant to the decision you're going to make in the next 48 hours whether you're ready to or not. Picard did not touch the chip. You're Section 31. I represent certain Federation interests that don't always find their best expression through official channels, the man said. It was, Picard recognized, a formulation designed to be technically accurate while communicating. Nothing useful. Your guest is a more significant situation than your current approach reflects. My current approach, Picard said carefully, is consistent with Federation law and Starfleet regulation. Your current approach, the man said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something to a person they respect but consider limited. assumes that the framework you're operating within is adequate to contain what you're dealing with. We're here to suggest that it isn't. He nodded toward the chip. Palpatine's energy readings. Our analysts have been working with the data your ship transmitted. Yes, we intercepted it before the Romulans did. That's a separate conversation. And what they've identified suggests that the Force, as he calls it, doesn't degrade in this universe. It adapts. He arrived at approximately 85% of his native capacity. 40 hours later, he's at 92. Another week, and he's at full power in an environment our technology was not designed to counter. Picard was quiet for a moment. You've been monitoring his biosigns remotely. We've been monitoring everything remotely since hour one. That's what we do. No apology in the voice, no discomfort. Just the flat factual delivery of a man who had made peace with what he was a long time ago. The Romulans want him as an intelligence asset. The Klingon don't know about him yet, but when they do, they'll want to test themselves against him. The Dominion, and this is the part that should concern you most, the Dominion's sensor network in the Alpha Quadrant picked up the dimensional rift. The Founders are already asking questions. The Dominion. The word landed with appropriate weight. The war had been over for less than 2 years. The rebuilding was still raw. The losses still present in every conversation that touched on it. The thought of the Founders' attention turning toward the Enterprise, toward whatever Palpatine represented. What does Section 31 want? Picard asked. We want him, the man said simply. Not imprisoned. That's not practical, and you've probably already worked that out. Not studied. Your science team is thorough, but they don't have the infrastructure. We want him transferred to a facility where his abilities can be properly assessed and, in time, properly utilized. Utilized, Picard repeated. The words sat between them like something unclean. He's a weapon, Captain. The most sophisticated one that has ever walked onto a Federation vessel. The question isn't whether someone uses him. Someone will. Eventually, because that's what weapons are for. The question is whether it's us or the Romulans or the Founders. The man's voice remained pleasant throughout, which was somehow worse than if he had been threatening. We're asking you to make a practical decision in a practical situation. You're good at those when you allow yourself to be. Picard stood. The act of standing, he had found, clarified things, physically claimed the space, reset the geometry of a conversation that had been arranged against him. What you are describing, he said, is the reduction of a sentient being to a strategic asset, regardless of what that being has done, regardless of what he is capable of. That is not something the Federation does. That is not something I do. He picked up the data chip and held it out. Take this. Leave my ship through whatever unauthorized method brought you here, and understand that if Section 31 attempts to access this vessel, or this crew again without my knowledge, I will file a full report with the Judge Advocate General's office, the Federation Council, and Admiral Janeway personally. The man looked at him for a moment. Then he took the chip. You know, he said, rising, most captains, when they've been in Starfleet long enough, develop a kind of practical flexibility, a recognition that the universe doesn't always fit the principles they started with. He moved toward the viewport rather than the door, which told Picard the transporter beam would extract him from there. You've been doing this longer than most. I've always found it interesting that you haven't. I've always found it interesting. Picard said that people who've abandoned their principles feel compelled to justify it to people who haven't. The man almost smiled. Then the transporter took him, and Picard was alone. He stood at his desk for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done in the 2 days since. Palpatine had arrived. He sat down, poured himself a cup of tea that had gone cold, and allowed himself, for exactly 60 seconds, to feel the full weight of what he was managing. An entity of unknown and growing power who was mapping his ship and his crew with every hour that passed. A Romulan intelligence operation already in motion. The Dominion's sensors turning in their direction. And now Section 31, confirming that the Federation's own shadow institutions had already decided what Palpatine was and what should be done with him. And in all of it, one fact that he returned to with the persistence of a man who believes that facts, properly understood, eventually point somewhere useful. Palpatine had not harmed anyone, had not threatened anyone, not directly, not explicitly, had cooperated with every request, answered every question, demonstrated his capabilities only once and two. Worf in terms that were more honest than hostile. He was doing something, clearly, deliberately, with the patience of a man who measured time in decades rather than hours. But he had not yet done it, which meant there was still time. Picard picked up his cold tea. There was always, he had found, still time, right up until there wasn't. He tapped his comm badge. Picard to Data. Data here, Captain. Meet me in the science lab in 20 minutes. And wake Dr. Crusher. A pause. I think it's time we understood exactly what is happening to our guests' power levels before someone else decides that understanding for us. The science lab on Deck 11 had the quality, at 0230 hours, of a place that existed slightly outside normal time. Overhead lighting dialed to working intensity while the rest of the ship ran on night cycle, a bubble of focused activity surrounded by sleeping corridors. Data had arrived before Picard, as Data always arrived before anyone, and had already arranged 3 separate display screens showing Palpatine's biosign progression across 47 hours in overlapping graphs that told, even at a glance, a story Picard did not enjoy reading. Dr. Crusher stood before the central display with her arms crossed and the expression she wore when medical data was telling her something she wished it weren't. Geordi had come without being asked. He had been awake anyway. He said, running diagnostics. On the EPS variants, the Section 31 operatives transporter had exploited. He stood at the secondary console with a cup of coffee and the focused frown of an engineer who had found a problem he couldn't immediately solve. Show me, Picard said. Data touched the display. At the moment of Palpatine's arrival, his force energy output registered at what I am designating as baseline 84. This figure represents my best calibration of his native capacity, based on the dimensional rift's energy signature at the moment of transit. The rift essentially provides a snapshot of the power level required to traverse it, which gives us a reference point. He moved to the progression graph. 47 hours later, he is reading at 93.7. The increase is not linear. It accelerates slightly with each passing cycle, suggesting an adaptive process rather than simple recovery. Like a muscle, Crusher said. The more he uses it here, the more efficiently his physiology learns to draw on whatever this universe offers as a substitute for his home environment. That is an apt biological analogy, yes, Data said. At current rate of progression, I project he reaches full native capacity in approximately 6.2 days. However, I must note that this projection assumes the adaptive process does not itself accelerate, which the trend suggests it may. So potentially sooner, Riker said from the doorway. He had come in behind Picard, which Picard had expected. Riker had a quality of appearing wherever he was needed before he was called that had never stopped being useful. He carried his own coffee, and the look of a man who had not slept, and had decided to be functional about it. What does full capacity look like? Concretely, Data considered, based on Palpatine's own descriptions of his abilities, cross-referenced with the energy output readings we have recorded and extrapolated forward. At full capacity, he would be capable of generating force lightning sufficient to overwhelm our internal shield emitters, telekinetic force capable of compromising structural integrity on multiple decks simultaneously, neural influence, what he has described as mind domination at a range that could theoretically encompass the entire crew. He paused with the slight hesitation he employed when delivering information he calculated would be unwelcome. And based on the dimensional rift analysis, there is a possibility that at full capacity he could generate sufficient force energy to open a return transit, unassisted, from anywhere on the ship. The lab was quiet. He could leave whenever he wants, Geordi said. Eventually. Eventually, yes. Not yet. But the window during which our containment options are meaningful is narrowing. Data looked at Picard. I calculate we have between 4 and 6 days, during which intervention remains viable. After that, any attempt to physically constrain him becomes largely theoretical. Picard moved to the display, studying the progression curve with the attention of a man looking for something in a graph that the graph might not contain. Has he shown any awareness that we're tracking this? He has given no indication, Data said. However, given what Counselor Troy has described regarding his capacity for managed emotional output, and given his demonstrated ability to detect our internal sensor grid within seconds of arrival, I think it would be imprudent to assume he is unaware. He knows, Riker said flatly. He's known his power is growing, and he's let us watch it happen, which means either he doesn't consider us a threat capable of acting on the information, or he wants us to know, Picard said quietly. The thought occupied the room for a moment. Why would he want us to know? Crusher asked. Picard turned from the display. Because knowledge of a threat creates pressure. Pressure creates decisions. And decisions made under pressure are rarely the decisions we would make in its absence. He looked at Riker. Section 31 came to me tonight. They want him transferred to one of their facilities. They framed it as a practical necessity. Before the Romulans or the Dominion move first. And Palpatine knows about Section 31, Riker said. He said it not as a question, but as the completion of a logical sequence. The way a chess player names a move they've seen coming. He surfaced it in the hearing. Deliberately. He is creating conditions, Picard said, in which everyone around him makes the decisions he would prefer them to make. The Romulans reach out, confirming to us that our communications are compromised, and that he has options beyond Starfleet cooperation. Section 31 arrives, demonstrating that our own institutions are willing to reduce him to an asset and creating pressure on me to act precipitously. His power grows visibly, establishing a deadline that makes measured response feel like a luxury. He stopped. He is not escaping well. He is not trying to escape. He is engineering the circumstances under which we will make a mistake. Riker set down his coffee. What kind of mistake? The kind that validates him, Picard said. If we transfer him to Section 31, we confirm that Federation principles yield to expediency under sufficient pressure. If we attempt to forcibly suppress his abilities and fail, we demonstrate our limitations and his superiority. If we release him, we lose any ability to account for what he does next. He moved to the viewport at the lab's far end, the stars beyond running slowly past in warp transit. He has arranged a situation in which every available response compromises something we value. That is not improvisation. That is decades of political craft applied to a new environment in under 2 days. Then what do we do? Geordi asked. Picard was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that Crusher glanced at Riker, who gave the small headshake that meant, let him think. We do what he does not expect, Picard said finally. Because every manipulation he has constructed assumes we will behave as institutions behave, as power structures calculating advantage. He turned from the viewport. He has not yet encountered what happens when someone simply refuses to play. He looked at each of them in turn, the engineer, the doctor, the first officer, the android, the people who had, over years, become something the regulations didn't have a precise word for. I am going to speak with him alone. No security, no recording, no official proceeding. Riker began. Captain. I know, Picard said. But I believe there is something beneath the architecture he has shown us. Something genuine that all the strategy is built on top of. And I believe the only way to reach it is to stop treating this as a containment problem and start treating it as a conversation between two people. He picked up his jacket from the back of a chair. He has been, throughout everything, completely honest. He told Worf exactly what he was capable of. He told us about Section 31 by reading our reactions. He did not harm the ensigns in the gymnasium when he easily could have. He paused. I think he is waiting for someone to ask him a question that isn't tactical. What question? Crusher asked. Picard considered. Why he's still here, he said. When everything he has done suggests he could make other arrangements. If he chose to, he moved toward the door. A man who has governed a trillion lives across a galaxy does not sit in a Starfleet brig reading the emotional subtext of his guards because he has no other options. He is here because something about this ship, or this crew, or this conversation is giving him something he came looking for. He stopped at the threshold. I intend to find out what. The corridor outside was dim, the ship breathing slowly around him in the dark. Somewhere 4 decks below, in comfortable quarters under continuous sensor monitoring, An old man in black robes was either sleeping or waiting. Picard suspected, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had been paying attention, that it was the latter. The quarters assigned to Palpatine were on Deck 8. A standard senior visitor allocation with a viewport, a replicator, a sleeping area separated from the main room by a partition, and furniture arranged with the neutral functionality that Starfleet designers believed communicated welcome without presumption. Someone on the hospitality rotation had placed a small arrangement of flowers from the arboretum on the low table near the viewport, a gesture so specifically human and so specifically kind that Picard had noticed it in the security feed and chosen not to comment on it. Small dignities mattered. He had always believed that. He dismissed the security detail outside the door with a look that communicated this was not a discussion. They exchanged the glance of junior officers who have been given an order they consider inadvisable and have the professional good sense to follow anyway. And they withdrew to the corridor intersection, 30 meters away, close enough to respond, far enough to provide the fiction of privacy that Picard needed the conversation to have. He pressed the chime. "Come in, Captain," Palpatine said, as though he had been expecting him, as though he had, perhaps, been expecting him for some time. The room was dark except for the viewport, the stars beyond running in the slow smear of low warp, and the faint amber glow of the replicator's standby light. Palpatine sat in the chair nearest the viewport, not the chair facing the door, not the defensive positioning of a man managing his environment, but the chair facing outward, toward the stars, as though he had been watching them the way Picard sometimes watched them from his ready room when he needed to think and had run out of useful thoughts. Picard sat in the chair across the low table. Between them, the flowers the hospitality officer had placed. Neither of them acknowledged the flowers, which meant both of them had noticed them. For a moment, neither spoke. The stars moved. "You dismissed your security detail," Palpatine said. "I did." That is either very confident or very reckless. He did not turn from the viewport. "Given what you know about my capabilities at this stage of my recovery, I would suggest reckless." "I prefer to think of it," Picard said, "as a gesture of good faith." Palpatine turned then, slowly, and looked at him with an expression that was the most unguarded Picard had seen since his arrival, not soft, not warm exactly, but stripped of the particular layered performance quality that Troy had described. Whatever was in the yellow eyes now was old and complicated and, Picard thought, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. "You want to know why I'm still here?" Palpatine said. Picard did not ask how he knew that. "Yes." The old man looked back at the viewport. A long moment passed, measured in stars. "I have governed," he said finally, and his voice had lost the careful modulation that turned everything into strategy. "For a very long time. I began with a vision, genuine. I want you to understand that. Whatever you believe about my methods, I believed that the Republic was dying. I believed that only concentrated authority, ruthlessly applied, could hold civilization together against the chaos pressing at every border. I was not wrong about the diagnosis." A pause. "I may have been wrong about the cure. I have not, until recently, allowed myself to examine that possibility with any seriousness." Picard said nothing. He had learned, over many years, that silence was sometimes the most important contribution a listener could make. "Your Federation troubles me," Palpatine said. It came out not as a criticism, but as an admission, something confessed rather than argued. "Not because it is weak. I came here expecting weakness dressed in principle, which is what most idealistic institutions are when examined honestly. What I found instead was," he paused, searching for precision in a way that suggested the precision mattered to him. "Genuine, imperfect, contradictory, inhabited by people who fail their own standards regularly and return to those standards anyway. That is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Picard asked. "What I built. A structure that proclaims values it cannot afford to practice. Staffed by people who have learned to recite principle while practicing expediency." He looked at Picard directly. "I expected Section 31 to be your real government. I expected to find, beneath the Starfleet uniform and the Prime Directive, the same calculus I applied, order maintained through controlled fear, values as rhetoric rather than reality." His voice was very quiet. "I have been here for 2 days, and I have been studying. Your crew with every tool available to me. I have been in that gymnasium with your Klingon. I have sat across from you in 4 separate interactions and attempted, with considerable skill, to find the fracture between what you say and what you are." He stopped. "And," Picard said. "And Worf was right," Palpatine said. "There is no fracture." Something moved through the yellow eyes, not quite pain, but the specific discomfort of a man revising. A belief he has held for 60 years and finding the revision physically uncomfortable. "You are exactly what you appear to be. Your crew is exactly what it appears to be. The Federation is not perfect, not without its Section 31s, and its compromises and its moments of catastrophic moral failure, but it is genuinely trying, in ways that my empire never was, because I never permitted it to try." He looked at his own hands. "That is a significant thing to sit with." Picard leaned forward slightly. "Why did you come here? To the Enterprise, specifically. Why did the rift bring you here?" "It didn't bring me," Palpatine said. "I told you the rift may have opened because of me. That was accurate, as far as it went." He was quiet for a moment. "I have lived my entire life in service of a vision that required me to be, at all times, in complete control of my environment, of my allies, of my enemies, of myself. There is, in that kind of life, no room for doubt. Doubt is a vulnerability. I eliminated it the way. I eliminated every vulnerability, thoroughly and without mercy." He looked at the viewport again. "And then something happened in my galaxy that I had not foreseen. A boy, a Jedi, the son of the man I had broken most thoroughly of all, who looked at me and saw not the Emperor but the man beneath, who chose, in the moment when he had every reason not to believe that something could be redeemed." His voice was, Picard realized, utterly without the performative quality it had carried for 2 days. This was not strategy. He died for it. And I, a pause of considerable weight. I found myself uncertain, for the first time in 60 years, whether I had been right about anything. The stars moved in the viewport. "The rift," Palpatine said, "opened during a meditation. I was attempting to resolve the uncertainty through the dark side, to reaffirm the philosophy that has governed my life. Instead, I found myself here." He looked at Picard, which suggests either that the Force has a sense of irony, or that uncertainty, pursued far enough, becomes its own kind of doorway. Picard sat with this for a long moment. The weight of it was considerable, not just the information, but what it implied. He thought about what he knew of the dark side, of what Palpatine had described as his power source, and about the Section 31 operative sensor data, and about the progression curve on Data's display, and about something that had been sitting at the edge of his thinking since the greenhouse conversation earlier that day. "Your power is growing," he said. "You know that we've been tracking it. You've allowed us to track it." He met the yellow eyes. "But I don't think it's growing because this universe is charging you. I think it's growing because you've been performing certainty for 2 days, and the performance itself generates the energy. The dark side feeds on the will to dominate. You've been dominating every interaction since you arrived." He paused. "What happens to your power level if you stop?" The silence that followed was the longest since Picard had entered the room. Palpatine looked at him with an expression that moved through several things too quickly to name, and settled, finally, on something that was almost recognition. The look of a man who has been seen accurately and is deciding how to respond to it. "That," he said softly, "is a genuinely dangerous question." "I know," Picard said. "I'm asking it anyway." Outside, through the viewport, the stars continued their indifferent procession. Somewhere in the ship, Picard knew, Worf was monitoring sensor feeds. Data was running calculations. Riker was awake and watchful. The Enterprise moved through the dark with its crew intact and its principles intact, and its captain sitting across from a man who had governed a galaxy through fear and was, perhaps for the first time in his very long life, genuinely unsure what happened next. Picard did not move, did not reach for a tactical advantage, did not press, did not allow the silence to become pressure. He simply waited, the way you wait for someone who is standing at a threshold, not pushing, not pulling, just present, just there, offering, with no guarantee of acceptance. The hardest thing one person can offer another, the possibility that something can be different. The answer, when it came, was not words. Palpatine sat in the chair facing the viewport for a long time after Picard's question, long enough that the stars outside completed a full navigational cycle, long enough that the ship's ambient systems cycled through their 0300 maintenance routines with the quiet efficiency of a vessel breathing in sleep. Picard did not move, did not speak, held the space the way he had learned to hold it. Across 30 years of negotiations where the moment of genuine contact was almost always preceded by a silence that lesser diplomats had filled and thereby destroyed. Then, with a slowness that was different from all his previous movements, not the deliberate economy of a man managing his presentation, but something closer to exhaustion, to the careful movement of someone setting down a weight they have carried so long they have forgotten. It is separate from them. Palpatine closed his eyes. The change was immediate and measurable. 3 decks above, Data watched the biosign display and said nothing for 4 seconds, which was, for Data, a significant pause. The force energy reading, which had been climbing in its steady, adaptive curve toward the 94% threshold, simply stopped. Then, with the gradual certainty of a tide going out, began to recede. Not dramatically, not the catastrophic power drain of a system failure. The slow, deliberate descent of something being voluntarily released. The way a held breath is released, not forced out, but allowed to go. 93.1, 92.4, 91.8. In the science lab, Geordi watched the same readings over Data's shoulder and said, very quietly, "Is he doing what I think he's doing?" "He is voluntarily suppressing his force energy output," Data said. "The process appears to be conscious and controlled. He is not losing power. He is choosing not to use it." Geordi looked at the display for a moment. "Does the captain know?" "The captain," Data said, with the particular tone he used when stating something that functioned simultaneously as fact and as something more, "is the reason it is happening." In the quarters on Deck 8, Picard watched the man across the table and did not speak and did not look away. Something was occurring that he did not fully understand and that he suspected no Federation instrument was calibrated to measure. Something that had less to do with energy readings and power levels than with the specific gravity of a moment when a human being, or something that had once been more fully human before it chose otherwise, arrived at the edge of its own mythology and looked over. Palpatine opened his eyes. They were the same yellow, that had not changed and would not change, whatever had happened in 60 years of immersion. In what he called the dark side had left its physical mark permanently, and Picard did not expect otherwise and had not needed otherwise. He had not come here for transformation. He had come for conversation. There was a difference, and it mattered. "In my experience," Palpatine said, and his voice was quieter than Picard had yet heard it. Stripped of the resonance it used when performing authority, power used is still power held. The holding itself is a form of domination. He looked at his hands again, a gesture Picard had noticed twice now. As though the hands were a text, he returned to when language became insufficient. "You asked what happens to my power if I stop performing certainty. The honest answer is that I don't know. I have not stopped performing certainty since I was a young man on Naboo who decided that the galaxy required remaking, and that he was the instrument of that remaking." A pause. "It is a very long time to be certain." "It is," Picard agreed simply. "Your crew," Palpatine said. "The Klingon who will not be maneuvered. The android who states uncomfortable truths without cruelty. The doctor who placed flowers in a prisoner's room." He stopped on that for a moment. "The doctor who placed flowers in a prisoner's room," he repeated, as though the sentence required a second passage to be properly understood. "I have not, in a very long time, encountered kindness that was not tactical. It is disorienting." "It was Ensign Voss," Picard said, "from the Arboretum rotation. She does it for every new arrival to sickbay." Palpatine looked at the flowers. "She was on the bridge when I arrived. She lost her breath." "Yes." "And she still placed flowers." "Yes." The old man was quiet for a moment that had a different quality from all his previous silences, not the strategic pause, not the calculated beat, but the silence of a person genuinely processing something that does not fit their existing model of how people are. "That is," he said finally, "a remarkable small act." "The Federation," Picard said carefully, "is built on remarkable small acts. The large gestures, the treaties, the battles, the declarations, Those are visible. But what holds it together is the accumulation of what people do when no one is requiring them to do anything. He met the yellow eyes. Ensign Voss was afraid of you. She is still afraid of you, I expect. And she placed flowers. Palpatine looked at him for a long moment. You are telling me that courage in your civilization is not the absence of fear. I'm telling you that we've never expected it to be. Another silence. The stars outside had shifted. They were approaching the coordinates where Riker had quietly, on Picard's standing order, maintained a holding pattern for the last 6 hours, keeping the ship in open space, away from populated systems, away from the Romulan border, away from anything that a man at 93% power and rising might look at and calculate as an opportunity. They had run out of natural reasons to stay in this particular stretch of nothing. Tomorrow there would be questions from Starfleet Command about their delayed arrival at Starbase 375, the pressure that Picard had been holding back through the simple mechanism of not acknowledging. It would begin, in earnest, to arrive. He did not have more time to let this be what it was. He had tonight. The dimensional rift, Picard said. Data believes that with sufficient force energy and our assistance, modulating the quantum variance in the subspace membrane, we could reconstruct the conditions of your transit. Send you back. He paused. It would require your cooperation, your active participation, and it would require your power at near full capacity, which means the suppression you've just begun would need to be reversed for the duration of the transit event. Palpatine's gaze sharpened, not with the predatory attention of the first 2 days, but with something cleaner, the focus of a man encountering a genuine question. You are offering to send me home. I am offering you a choice, Picard said, which is, I think, what you have not had in a very long time. The word choice sat in the room. Palpatine looked at the viewport, at the stars, at the flowers, at his hands, at Picard, the inventory of a man who has spent 60 years reducing everything in his environment to its strategic utility and is attempting, in one late and exhausted night, to look at things differently. And if I return, he said slowly, I return to a galaxy where a young man's act of faith has created consequences, political instability, the beginnings of something that may become what your Federation is, or may become something worse, depending on what fills the vacuum I left. He paused. I am not, despite everything, certain that my absence is better for those trillion lives than my presence. I can't answer that, Picard said. I don't know your galaxy. I don't know its people or its politics, or what it needs from this moment forward. He leaned forward slightly. But I know that a man who is asking that question, genuinely asking it, not rhetorically, not as performance, is a different man from the one who walked through that rift 2 days ago. And different men make different choices. He held the yellow eyes. Whatever you decide to do when you return, you will be deciding it as someone who has sat in this room and asked whether he was right about anything. That is not nothing. Palpatine was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, I will need several hours to rebuild sufficient capacity for the transit. Picard nodded. We'll need 12 hours to prepare the equipment. Data will want to walk you through the modulation process. Your android, Palpatine said, will want to ask me 17 additional questions about the Force during that process. Almost certainly, Picard agreed. Something happened in Palpatine's face that was not quite a smile, and not quite its opposite. Something older than either. The expression of a man at the end of a very long road who has not yet decided whether arriving is a relief or a loss, but who has decided to arrive nonetheless. Tell your ensign Voss, he said quietly, that the flowers were noted. Picard stood. I will. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused, not for effect, not for the careful staging of a moment, but because something genuine had occurred in this room, and he was himself taking a moment to acknowledge it before the logistics and the command decisions and the Starfleet reports absorbed it back into the machinery of institution. For what it's worth, he said, without turning, I believe the young man who looked at you and saw something worth redeeming was not wrong to look. He let the door close behind him. In the corridor, the ship breathed around him, the hum of systems, the distant pulse of the warp core, the sound of a crew sleeping and working, and placing flowers in rooms for people who frightened them. He stood for a moment in the dim light of the night cycle, captain of a vessel that had, in the last 48 hours, contained an emperor, resisted a shadow organization, declined a Romulan overture, and managed to remain, through all of it, recognizably itself. He tapped his comm badge. Picard to Data. Data here, Captain. Begin calculations for a quantum variance modulation event. I'll brief you in the morning. A pause. And Data, leave room in the schedule for questions. Our guest will have some. Understood, Captain. I will also have some. Picard almost smiled. I know, he said. Good night, Mr. Data. He walked back toward his quarters through the quiet ship, and the Enterprise moved through the dark. And somewhere 4 decks below, in a room with flowers on the table, an old man who had ruled a galaxy sat in the starlight and was, for the first time in 60 years, genuinely uncertain what came next. He found, to his considerable surprise, that uncertainty felt less like weakness than he remembered. The transit event lasted 11 minutes and 43 seconds. Data had spent the intervening 12 hours in a state that his crewmates recognized as the android equivalent of barely contained enthusiasm, running 17 successive modulation calculations, asking Palpatine 42 questions about force mechanics. He had projected 17. The reality exceeded his estimate, which he noted in his personal log as a point of interest, and producing a theoretical framework for quantum variance manipulation that he submitted simultaneously to the Federation Science Council and the Daystrom Institute under the modest title Preliminary Notes on Dimensional Membrane Permeability and Non-Standard Energy Catalysts. It would be debated for a decade. Geordi had rebuilt the deflector dish modulation array twice before he was satisfied. Dr. Crusher had run a final biosign assessment and said nothing medically relevant, but had, at the conclusion of the scan, wished Palpatine good luck with the directness of someone who means it and knows it is insufficient and says it anyway. Worf had been present at the transit chamber and had said nothing at all, which was its own form of acknowledgement, a Klingon warrior's recognition that something had occurred that the warrior tradition did not have adequate language for. Ensign Voss had not been present. She had been on con duty. But someone, no one claimed responsibility, and Picard did not investigate, had left a second small arrangement of arboretum flowers at the entrance to the transit chamber. They were still there when the event began. Palpatine stood in the modulation field with his eyes closed and his hands open at his sides, the posture, Picard noted, of a man receiving rather than taking, which was different from every other posture he had held since his arrival. The force energy readings climbed as he drew his power deliberately upward through the adaptive pathways his physiology had been building for 2 days, the curve reversing its suppression in a controlled ascent that Data tracked with quiet precision. At the moment of transit, the field opened, not the wound quality of his arrival, but something cleaner, a parting rather than a tearing, the subspace membrane yielding to the resonance frequency. Data had spent 12 hours calculating, and Palpatine spent his final 30 seconds on the Enterprise generating, with the focused exactness of a man who has decided to do one last thing well. He looked at Picard in the final moment before the field took him. He did not say live long and prosper. He did not make any gesture of the kind that stories tend to assign to final moments, because he was not, whatever else he was, a sentimental man. He simply looked, and Picard, who had learned to read people across 30 years of encounters that defied the rulebooks he'd been trained with, saw in the yellow eyes, briefly, clearly, before the light took everything, something he had not expected and would not forget. Gratitude. The rift closed. The chamber was empty. The stars outside continued. Starfleet Command received Picard's official report 6 hours later. Admiral Janeway called personally. The conversation was long, careful, and notable for the number of things both parties understood, but neither found it useful to say explicitly. The report was classified at a level that ensured it would be read by exactly the people who needed to read it and debated by exactly the committees that would do the least damage debating it. Section 31 did not make contact again. Whether this indicated satisfaction, reassessment, or simply the organization's characteristic preference for letting situations resolve, and returning when the dust settled. Picard could not determine. He found, on balance, that he preferred not to know. The Romulans sent a follow-up communication 3 days later, formally inquiring about the status of their sanctuary offer. Picard replied through official channels that the individual in question had departed Federation space and that the offer was therefore moot. The response from Subcommander Velith was 13 words long and conveyed with the compressed elegance of someone who has spent a career saying difficult things in very few words, that the Tal Shiar would be watching the Enterprise with renewed interest going forward. Picard filed this under expected consequences and replicated himself a cup of Earl Grey. What the official report did not contain, what Picard had written in his personal log in the 0400 hour after Palpatine's departure and then sat with for a long time before deciding to leave. Exactly as written was this: the Federation's principles were not tested today by a being too powerful to contain. They were tested by a being sufficiently wise to see them clearly and sufficiently honest to say what he saw. That we held is not because we were stronger. It is because we were, on this occasion, exactly what we claimed to be. The question that will outlast this log entry is whether we can say the same tomorrow, and the day after, and in the moments when no emperor is watching to tell us the difference. He did not know what Palpatine would do when he returned to his galaxy. He did not know whether the uncertainty the man carried back through the rift would produce wisdom or simply a more sophisticated tyranny. He knew, with the realism that 30 years of command had built into him alongside the idealism it had never managed to remove, that one conversation in a room with flowers did not redeem a life or reverse a galaxy or resolve the vast and terrible consequences of 60 years of absolute power. But he also knew what Palpatine had said about the young man who had looked at an emperor and seen something worth redeeming. He had not been wrong to look. Neither, Picard believed, had he. The Enterprise jumped to warp and resumed its heading, carrying its crew and its principles, and its small acts of unrequired kindness forward into the dark, somewhere across the membrane of dimensions, in a galaxy bound by a force that connected all living things. An old man arrived back in a universe that had not yet decided what came next. Neither had he. That, at least, was a beginning. He did not know what Palpatine would do when he returned to his galaxy. He did not know whether the uncertainty the man carried back through the rift would produce wisdom or simply a more sophisticated tyranny. He knew, with the realism that 30 years of command had built into him alongside the idealism it had never managed to remove, that one conversation in a room with flowers did not redeem a life or reverse a galaxy or resolve the vast and terrible consequences of 60 years of absolute power. But he also knew what Palpatine had said about the young man who had looked at an emperor and seen something worth redeeming. He had not been wrong to look. Neither, Picard believed, had he. The Enterprise jumped to warp and resumed its heading, carrying its crew and its principles, and its small acts of unrequired kindness forward into the dark, somewhere across the membrane of dimensions, in a galaxy bound by a force that connected all living things. An old man arrived back in a universe that had not yet decided what came next. Neither had he. That, at least, was a beginning.